Hello world, and welcome back to the Dweebatron channel. In episode 7, we will talk about fruit jars, Georgian tumblers, and field research. First, let's take a look at what sold. This Fenton Bell sold for $28.75. I paid a little more for this than I would normally pay because I knew it would sell very quickly. When there is a milk glass crest around the edge, they call that snow crest. Everything Snowcrest sells quickly. I sold this purple bottle for $16. This was an old mustard bottle. This is a fairly common shape for mustard bottles and is called a barrel mustard. I found this particular mustard jar in the field across from my great-grandparents' house in Okanagan, Washington when I was a teenager. The purple color is caused by manganese in the glass, which turns purple over a period of time after exposure to sunlight or ultraviolet rays. Some people consider it damage, some people consider it cool. You be the judge. These Ray-Ban frames sold for $15. These are pretty common. Many Ray-Bans sell for much more. Another piece of Fostoria Alexis sold out of my store this week. A small-footed bowl like this on the Victorian table was called a jam stand or jelly compote. A compote is a footed bowl. Only the small ones like this are considered jam stands. It's about 5.5 inches tall. This Parker pen sold for $12. Remember, we talked about these before. You just want to watch for that arrow clip in a pile of pens, and that's a Parker. Another Black Label beer opener sold, this time for $5.95. That was Black Label opener number 6 from this slot. I still have more. This Hamm's beer opener with the bear logo on it sold for $9, or 300 times what I paid for it. Remember, we talked about this super collectible bear in an earlier episode. I accepted an offer of $40 for this Pyrex double boiler. I probably could have held out and gotten $50, but I went for the quick flip. I sold this pitcher for $40. This piece is by Metlock's Pottery from their Poppy Trail line in a pattern known as Sculptured Daisy. I have another pitcher just like it ready to sell next. Eureka! It's another jam stand. This one was made in 1901 by the National Glass Company in a pattern known as Eureka, and it sold for $24.75. The ruby stain is painted on after the glass is pressed in a mold. I just love this one. I sold this empty beer bottle for $15. Just about any older bottle with the paper label intact has at least some collectible value. This one even had the original bottle cap on it. Also, this beautiful old milk pitcher from 1904 sold for $38.75. This was made by Tarentum Glass Company in their Dalton pattern. Alright, let's talk about fruit jars. My earliest interest in glass started with old bottles. I found this very bottle in a ditch bank while walking home from school when I was just 12 years old. I painted the letters for display purposes when I was a teenager, and somewhere along the way I added a cork apparently, but this bottle shown here was the find that sparked a lifelong interest in objects made from melted sand. After finding this, I started learning all about old bottles and discovered that old fruit jars, which are basically a type of bottle, were very collectible. This was something I found particularly interesting at the time because I found myself growing up in one of the fruit canningest areas in the world, an area where orchards were everything for pretty much all of the 20th century. My first job was at one of the local fruit warehouses. Anyway, fruit jars are still very much collected to this day. Here is one that recently sold on eBay. Wouldn't you like to find that for $5 at a yard sale? If you are interested in learning more about fruit jars, there is one book that all the jar collectors refer to, and that is called The Red Book. This version 9 copy is my own, but there are newer copies available these days. There are many thousands of different jars that you can find out there. I don't try to memorize all of them, I just watch for inexpensive jars that I don't recognize. Then it's like buying a lottery ticket. At the very worst in this case, I'll still make some money from my efforts, and if it's a good jar, then booyah! Here's a jar I recently found and listed in my store. I had never heard of a Bosco jar. And here is a cool Amazon Swift Seal jar that I decided not to sell because I like it more than what I think I could get for it. By the way, the lids to the jars or the closure mechanisms can be worth as much or more than the jars themselves. Here is a lid that sold for nearly $150. So keep an eye out for those old jars and lids. Who knows what you will find? Let's talk for a bit about Georgian tumblers. Logically, you would think that a Georgian tumbler would be a tumbler made during the Georgian period, which was from 1714 to 1837, when a bunch of different Georges were ruling over over England. But that is not the case. You've probably seen a Georgian tumbler before. They look like this. I tried to find out more about the history of Georgian tumblers, but I could not find out anything more than what I already knew. What I already knew was that during the Georgian period, they probably did have tumblers similar to these, but they didn't call them Georgian tumblers. By the Victorian period, in the late 1800s, there were lots of companies making various versions of a honeycomb pattern, and yet none of them called their pattern Georgian. It may have been Cambridge Glass Company that first came out with the modern Georgian tumbler. They came out with a line called Georgian in 1931. Fenton Glass came out with a competing pattern in the same year, but when it came out, it was called Agua Caliente, which is Spanish for hot water. I don't know when they started calling it Georgian. Duncan and Miller Glass Company also came out with a Georgian pattern, but not until 1935. However, Payton City Glass also made a Georgian pattern, and I don't know when they started making it. Anyway, the pattern was super popular, and somewhere around 25 different glass companies ended up making at least a version of the Georgian tumbler. I collected Georgian tumblers for a while and built up my collection by watching eBay for listings with multiple Georgian tumblers identified incorrectly. So for example, I would buy a group of 5 incorrectly listed Georgian tumblers and then keep one for my collection and then correctly list the other 4. I managed to turn a profit every single time and grew up an impressive collection of tumblers, which after a while became a bit ridiculous, and so I sold them all. Somehow, Georgian tumblers still manage to creep into my cupboards from time to time. Maybe you have some in your cupboards. Field research. I have really enjoyed watching this topic evolve. For many, many years, dealers had to rely almost exclusively on books, magazines, and other dealers to learn about antiques and collectibles. With the advent of the internet and eBay, a whole new avenue of research developed. I started buying reference books on coins and bottles in the 1970s. Today, I have dozens of reference books on various collectibles. Now, I have known people that took their books around with them when they went to the estate sale. That was never my style. When I first started hunting for things to sell on eBay, I didn't have a way to look anything up at sales, since I refused to lug around a bunch of books with me every time. I had a set of rules for making purchases for resale that went basically like this. If an item was number 1, old, number 2, in good condition, number 3, inexpensive, and number 4, had a searchable name or brand that I could look up online when I got home, then as long as it met those 4 conditions, I would buy it. But this method, although it worked pretty well, had its problems. Most noticeably, I was buying a lot of junk. Fortunately, the good finds I was making well outweighed the results of the less stellar finds I was bringing home. But also, my third qualifier, that the item be inexpensive, is relative based on how much you could sell it for. So if I found myself at a sale, not knowing if something was worth purchasing, I would make a note of the item and look it up when I got back home. Often I would be glad that I didn't make the purchase. Other times I would end up racing back to the sale, hoping the item was still there. And unfortunately, it often was not. At first, I used a microcassette recorder to record the things I wanted to look up when I got home. But back then, people didn't all have phones on them all the time, and hearing someone talk to themselves was pretty strange. And I got too self-conscious about it and started carrying around a notepad and pen with me. Soon I had a dash-mounted GPS, and I used it not only to find the estate sales, but I would also then use it to find the nearest library, so I could use the library's computer to look up the things I was curious about, without having to drive all the way back home. Not long after I started doing that, the technology improved further, and I was able to get a power inverter to plug into my cigarette lighter that would power up my laptop, and they invented air cards so that I was able to get mobile internet. Still, I would have to make notes in the sale, then come out to my car. It was much better than before, but it was still pretty slow, and I was still losing things by not grabbing them right away. Finally, in 2007, the iPhone came out, and I was able to look things up right as I saw them in the sale. I think it is a bit poignant and ironic that things have gone almost full circle, as I now dictate into my phone the things I want to look up, much like I used to do with the microcassette. That kind of thing is not considered so weird anymore. Let me say this about looking things up to assess their value. Make sure you select the sold items to find out the value. Sellers can put whatever crazy price they want on something for sale, but when you search the sold listings instead, you will get an idea of what people are actually willing to pay. That's all the time we have for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching to the end. If you have enjoyed this discussion, you can push the subscribe button and the notification bell and get updates when I post new videos. And that reminds me of an exciting announcement. I have ordered what basically amounts to a portable spy camera so that I can take you with me to the thrift stores, estate sales, metal detecting, or wherever I go. I can't wait. Until next time, take good care of each other, and I'll see you then.